Welcome to Laney College and the Peralta Community College District.
To our students, you are the reason why we have this. We've got these extraordinary folks, and hopefully you will take the time to study their backgrounds. They've influenced policies. They certainly influence what has happened to many lives in this country, not just here in the East Bay and Alameda County in California, but across this country. So as we listen to them, I want you to ask yourself, why are they doing this? Why did they do what they did? How might I learn from their example? What is it that they're talking about? Why is what they're talking about significant? That's why you're here. We want you to leverage them in a way that literally stimulates your thinking, your critical thinking, and more importantly, open you up and let you understand your own personal genius so that you pursue it and pursue it with fervor in the way that these individuals have done, and much more. Without further ado, it's an honor. Odell.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Brosnahan. I've been a trial lawyer for 54 years, and I am delighted to be with you and spend this time this evening thinking more deeply than maybe we get a chance to do. If it's our trial, we don't get a chance to think about what it all means. But one of the things that we will direct your attention to is the question of what trials have meant in American history, especially some of the ones you're going to hear about. And we may have young people here who are thinking, well, what is this like? So I'll just tell you to take the suspense out of it. Being a trial lawyer is a really good life. I mean, you can have what I call fun, what other people call challenges, and it's as you will hear, you can participate sometimes in things that are actually historical. So what are we going to do? We're going to have a debate. And the three stellar people that we have here, I'm going to introduce them in a moment, are going to debate three cases. People versus Angela Davis, People versus Huey Newton. There's no greater piece of history, and there was no greater piece. I'm the moderator. Never mind. All right. Anyway, all these trials are really good. All right. People versus the state of California, O.J. Simpson. They're going to open, they're going to get 15 minutes each to tell you why that's the trial of the century. Of course, we're older people, we're talking about the last century, as you understand. And one of the interesting things about this subject, which I've been looking at since I was the age of the youngest person here, is how many great trials there have been in American history. And what it takes, and this panel knows that, to wade into the middle of these kinds of cases. What is that like? Sometimes it can be very lonely, but you have a client and you do what you can. So you'll hear about that. Now, the panel. The four of us have approximately 200 years of trial experience. We are as excited as we can be because, frankly, at our age, if I may use that expression, people don't want to hear about what happened, okay? And we bring it up, and the 70s was like this. Nobody wants to hear it. You're here, the doors are locked, you can't leave, and we're going to talk about some of the great things that happened. I also estimate that we have collectively over 400 trials among us. So we have been there, and we have done that. Let me do a greater service to this panel and start with John Burris, who must be known to many of you. He's been a plaintiff civil rights lawyer his whole career, really. He specialized in police misconduct. He's one of these, I don't care about the pressure of the moment, but I don't like what's going on, and I'm going to go do it, and he's been going and doing it all this long. And what's the point for the young people here? The point is that it keeps the power structure in line, or attempts to keep the power structure in line. He graduated from Bolts Hall in 1973. He got the police department to be under a court monitor for 5 years, and he brought the Rodney King civil suit and many other things. I cannot I would take all the time if I really did the great service to these folks that they deserve. Howard Moore, who I've known for a long time, has always been out there from the beginning, first day. You're looking for heroes from the civil rights movement, and you're looking at these folks right here. He graduated from Boston University in 1960. He clerked for Judge Charles Wyzanski, who was a brilliant judge in Boston, very famous judge at the time. He became one of 10 black lawyers in Georgia after that. He traveled with Vernon Jordan, very famous person in a lot of ways, on SCLC, SNCC, and CORE. Those were groups. I'm sure everybody here knows that. Maybe there's a couple that not too sure what that is. There once was ferment and insistence that things had to happen, and they had to happen now. And those groups were in the forefront of that effort. And he was right there doing all of that. He supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964, had a lot to do with trying to implement it, make it fair, and the Voting Rights Act. He's represented Julian Bond, and he's to see that Julian Bond would be seated, if you can believe it, in the Georgia House of Representatives. There's a lot more for each of these people, okay? Doron Weinberg, who got used to being announced last ever since he was in grade school because his name begins with a W. But there's no good reason for that. And I've known him for many years, like all the others. And he's done just about everything that you can do. He does white-collar crime, and he does orange jumpsuit crime. At cocktail parties, we like to say white-collar because it's more dignified, but the truth is there are these holding cells and these folks that need a lawyer, and he's been right there doing it. He's had corruption cases, homicide, drug crimes, civil and criminal forfeitures. He does appellate work as well, very versatile lawyer, and professional responsibility and ethics. Well, this gives you some idea of the talent that's seated on this stage. And so we will now start with 15 minutes on People versus Angela Davis. Howard?
Thank you. Good evening. I rise again in my ninth decade to advocate on behalf of Angela Davis. The trial of Angela Davis is unique in the history of American criminal trials. There is no other trial that you can find any place, anywhere in our history that's comparable to the Angela Davis case. In the Angela Davis case, People v. Angela Davis, who was charged with kidnap, murder, and conspiracy, the courthouse itself was the crime scene. Ordinarily, in criminal cases, the crime itself occurs elsewhere, not at the courthouse itself. The immediate victims of the alleged conspiracy, murder, and kidnap were the essential and critical participants in the administration of the criminal justice system. The judge, Harold Haley, the deputy district attorney, Gary Thomas, the jurors, 3 of whom were taken from the courtroom, 1 of whom was wounded in the aftermath, 2 of the defendant in the case, who was killed in the aftermath, and a witness who was killed in the aftermath, and a witness who was present on the stand at the time who was severely wounded, Rochelle McGee. Ordinarily, the people, the victims of the crime, are not the people who are the immediate participants in the crime. Now, with Angela Davis, you should know something about Angela Davis. And let me just give you a moment or two to tell you something about Angela Davis. Angela Davis was born in 1944 in Birmingham, Alabama. Her mother and father, Sally Davis and Frank Davis, were school teachers. Frank taught high school for a period of time before he became the proprietor of a service station. Mrs. Davis, Sally Davis, taught elementary school. Angela had another sister, Fanya Davis, who's here tonight, and two brothers, Benjamin and Reggie. For her early education, Angela was taught in the public schools of Birmingham, Alabama. When she had completed her junior high school, or what would be tantamount to junior high school, at the Parker High School Annex in Birmingham, Alabama, she won a scholarship from the American Friends Service Committee to go north. And she went to New York City and lived in Greenwich Village and went to high school at Elizabeth Irvin High School in New York City. There she did extremely well and won a scholarship to Brandeis University. And she graduated from Brandeis University with a degree in French. And then she went abroad to Frankfurt, Germany, to study philosophy. And she studied in Germany for a couple of years before she came back to the United States. Angela had always been a renegade of sorts and a soft heart for people who were less fortunate than she. When she was a young child in elementary school, she had the propensity to steal. She would steal cookies from her parents and from her brothers and sisters so that she could share them with young people who didn't have as much as she had. Angela Davis became a radical by choice and by force of her understanding of the real conditions that confronted the people of her country. Angela Davis could very well have been a trophy wife of a doctor or a mortician or other prominent person in the African American community, and never have been a radical, and lived a very comfortable and exciting life as a trophy wife. But that was not the direction that she took, even though that was a social expectation of the direction that she should have taken. It was not her family's expectation, but the social expectation. Angela spent a year of her college studies studying abroad in France. She lived with a French family and other students to learn French. She is fluent in French and German, and fluent, and she speaks, I believe, Spanish. And you all know that she's very fluent in English. That's who Angela Davis was in terms of her family history, immediate family history, and her educational history. Angela had offers at one time to teach at Princeton or at Swarthmore in philosophy, but she accepted a position in Los Angeles at UCLA because she liked the area and she liked the activity that was going on in the area at that time in the late 60s, 1969 to be particular. And while she was in Los Angeles, she became engaged with US, the nationalist organization. She saw the limitations of that organization. Then she became engaged with the Black Panther Party for a period of time. She saw issues with that particular organization. And then she became a member of the Communist Party of the United States. When it was learned that she was a member of the Communist Party of the United States, Governor Ronald Reagan directed the regents of the University of California to fire her. She went to court and she won her case, and she was reinstated. And then she was fired again. During that time, she developed an interest in the prison system and became active on behalf of 3 inmates who had been charged with the murder of a prison correctional official at Soledad Prison, who became known as the Soledad Brothers. And she was active along with others, and with the brother of George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, who was a 16-year-old genius. Young Jonathan was the only African-American student in his high school who was taking English, algebra, and U.S. history. And he was teased and harassed relentlessly about the fact that he was enrolled in such programs. But he was most concerned about his brother, George Jackson, who had been in prison for approximately 10 years for $70 robbery. And he was very active with respect to the Soledad Brothers. On August 7th, 1970, Jonathan Jackson entered a courtroom in Marin County. He entered the courtroom, he had several guns, 3 or 4 guns, all of which were registered in the name of Angela Davis. He took over the proceedings and then liberated from the proceedings 3 or 4 African-American brothers, Ruchell McGee, James McLean, William Christian, the 3 brothers actually, and took the judge, and to the judge's neck was taped a sawed-off shotgun, and the judge was led out of the courtroom with the district attorney and with 3 jurors, and I've told you about the jurors and all. When they got outside, Jonathan was killed, William McLean was killed, William Christian was killed, the district attorney was paralyzed, wounded and paralyzed, and the juror, Maria Graham, was wounded. Later on it was discovered that Angela Davis owned the guns that Jonathan Jackson had taken into the courtroom. At that point, the FBI, through J. Edgar Hoover, placed Angela on the most wanted list. And she was being sought all over the United States and all over the world. So you had the California legal authorities looking for Angela. The FBI was looking for Angela. And Interpol, the International Police Association, was on alert for Angela Davis. African-American women who resembled Angela Davis throughout the United States were stopped. Some were arrested because people believed that those people were Angela Davis. Eventually, Angela Davis was arrested on October 13, 1970. And after she was arrested, President Richard Nixon and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover appeared on national TV, and President Richard Nixon congratulated Director Hoover for apprehending terrorists such as Angela Davis. And the occasion was the passage of the Omnibus Crime Control Act, I think, of 1970. Angela resisted extradition to California. And she was brought back to California on December 22nd. She was taken at nighttime The Holland Tunnel was closed. She was brought back in a military aircraft in shackles, flown into Hamilton Air Force Base, shackled again, and escorted with National Guardsmen to the Marin County Jail. There was no evidence from any source that Angela Davis had committed any criminal act whatsoever. Yet she was put on trial for her life. It was thought that Angela Davis would certainly lose her case and would be executed. But in a remarkable turn of events, she rallied, with the help of the Communist Party and others, the people of the world. There were 200 committees in the United States that were established for Angela Davis. There were 67 committees throughout the world. Entertainers, other people in show business. Songs were written about Angela. A movie was made about Angela and was shown. And it was through the power of the people that Angela Davis was able to win her case. And what did the people do? In a political trial, the trial is actually held in secret in a way, because it's only indirectly that the defendant is accused, because the defendant is always accused of some criminal act, and the focus of the trial is on that criminal act rather than on the politics of the defendant itself. So what the power of the people did is that it forced the prosecution to change its theory of motivation to connect Angela to the events. From being a politically motivated crime, it was changed to be a crime of passion, based upon a diary that they found that she had written to George Jackson, with whom she did have a passionate relationship. And that diary was not found until sometime in July of 1971. Angela had already been in jail for close to 9 to 10 months. And the prosecution's theory was that Angela was motivated by passion, and that her passion knew no bounds, and that she would do anything to liberate her man, so to speak. Now, in the Angela Davis case, we did things that are seldom done and had never been done before. One of the things that we did in the Angela Davis case is that we motioned the court, and we got authority from the court that Angela could act as her own counsel with the assistance of lawyers. And this permitted Angela to make the opening statement at the trial. One of the other things that we did in the case, ordinarily, a defendant who is charged with a capital crime is not eligible for bail. We insisted that Angela was eligible for bail because the evidence against her was not great. And we waged a campaign that resulted in her being released on bail. And again, the power of the people, the presence of the people, appeared in her release on bail, because the judge, in releasing her on bail, referred to all of the letters that he had received from all over the world, including letters from the from the Congressional Black Caucus to free Angela Davis. There were a number of eyewitnesses against Angela Davis. So in order to combat the eyewitness testimony, we introduced a perceptual psychologist, Dr. Robert Buckhout, who explained to the jury how eyewitness testimony is unreliable and should not be credited. And when you read the book that was written by one of the jury people, the foreperson of the jury, Mary Timothy, you can see that that testimony was compelling with respect to the acquittal of Angela Davis. One of the other things that we did in the case that has become a staple of all cases now, major cases, is that we use psychologists. What does that mean? All right. We use psychologists to help us select the jury, and that gave us an advantage because we knew that we could select jurors who may not be necessarily open to the defense, but because of the composition of the group, that we would be able to get a result that we wanted. In the Angela Davis trial, the only trial would have been no trial at all.
The book that Howard mentioned is called Jurywoman, and it's by Timothy, Miss Timothy, and she served on the juror. And for any of the lawyers here who want more information, how to treat jurors, how to present to jurors, that's as good a book as I have read on that subject. And we turn now to the trial of People versus Huey Newton, Doron Weinberg.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Howard, for demonstrating what a challenge it is to do justice to these cases in the few minutes allotted. I'll try to do my best. First, I want to acknowledge Lisa Perlman and thank her for initiating this discussion about the trial of the century. It's really worthwhile, and it's really got a lot of us thinking, again, about how trials fit into society and the role they play and the impact they can have. She had a very quirky idea that the Huey Newton trial was a trial of the century, and she wrote a 600-page book about it. And she really has initiated a very substantial, very interesting, and very useful discussion. And along the way to this evening, she had another quirky idea of asking me to speak about the Newton case, to which my first response was, well, Lisa, I don't know that I agree with you that the Huey Newton case is the trial of the century. She said, doesn't matter, you're a lawyer, just make the best argument you can. So I said I would, and then I started to look at the Newton case. And in trying to decide whether it's the trial of the century, I thought I should start with what came before, and what did it do to deepen, enrich, take further things that had happened before it. And in that context, I actually came to agree with Lisa. Because if you look at the history of what are normally called trials of the century before Huey's case, you will see that Huey's case brought a dramatic additional set of levels to the way that trials, particularly major trials, particularly political trials, were handled and have been handled ever since. A couple of sentences about the Huey Newton, the case, and not everybody here will remember and know exactly what it was about. So Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the founders of the Black Panther Party here in Oakland in 1965 or 6. The Black Panther Party, full name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. This was a group of young people in the community who felt that they had to take militant measures in order to stand up for themselves, in order to stand against the oppression of society, and in order to build decent lives. And they did that with the recognition that sometimes it would be necessary to use violence, sometimes it would be necessary to use force. They showed up at Sacramento, 20 of them carrying rifles in a photo that terrified the entire country, at least the white community. But they were not only for self-defense, they also had a program. They had a 10-point program that they put out and worked towards in the community for racial, economic, and social justice. So in the black community, although outside the black community they were seen as the equivalent to terrorists in the 60s, within the black community they were a political force and a very well-regarded and well-recognized political force. But they were the objects of great suspicion, hostility, and violence from police and the FBI. There are a lot of episodes. Panthers were assassinated by law enforcement agents all around the country. In 1967, still in the early days of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, who had some history of arrests and violence, was stopped in his car by a police officer, John Frey, who had something of a history as a racist and a bully. Newton was removed from the car. There was a driver as well. By the time the incident was over, Frey had been killed, 2 shots. His partner had been shot, and Huey Newton had been shot in the gut. Huey Newton went off to the hospital where he was found and arrested. He was charged with murder, which under the facts at that time and under the law at that time could have resulted in the death penalty. And there weren't very many people who would have predicted that Huey Newton would get anything short of the death penalty. But that trial ended in a verdict that stunned everyone. It's still a little hard to explain. He was found guilty only of voluntary manslaughter, and he wound up spending only a few years in prison before he was able to come out again and resume his role in the Black Panther Party. That trial was seminal, because in looking at the previous trials that people talk about as trials of the century, I look at them and a couple of them involve celebrities, a couple of them involve sensational crimes. Most of them involve marginalized people who are scapegoated by society, who are outsiders, people like Bruno Richard Hauptmann, people like Sacco Vanzetti, Leo Frank. They were people without a constituency, people that didn't represent a community. And even the Rosenbergs, who in one sense and at one time represented a community, by the time they were tried, that community was nowhere to be found. They had lost almost all of their support. So they stood very much alone. Huey Newton was supported by a significant community throughout his trial. In all of the other landmark cases, there are crowds outside the courtroom, and they're screaming for the blood of the defendant. In the Huey Newton case, the crowds outside the courtroom were supporting Huey Newton. We're calling for his acquittal. Free Huey, free Huey, free Huey, or the sky's the limit, which was Eldridge Cleaver's famous threat. And so this was different. We, people of my age, actually, when we think about trials, big trials, we say, but wait a minute, Angela Davis, or Los Siete, or the Soledad brothers, or the Chicago 8. Those were all political trials. Yes, but they all came after Huey. Look for one that fits that description before Huey, and you won't find it. The reason is that Huey Newton represented something in the community, and these are not my words, but I think they're very eloquent. He represented the militant, articulate expression of the anger and aspirations of poor, young black people. And that's what he was about, and that's what he made his trial about. And his lawyer understood that and took it with him. The lawyer was Charlie Gary, a white lawyer, and that was a very controversial decision for Huey Newton, one of the main people, the founder of the Black Panther Party, to choose a white lawyer to represent him. It was a brave choice on his part and very, very unpopular with his constituents. There really were no other alternatives. Clint White, who was the only other lawyer, African-American lawyer of stature, priced himself out of the case. He didn't want to do it. And there was really nobody else. But Charlie was willing to do it. Huey stuck with him. Huey believed in him. And Charlie ran that case with the same understanding that Huey had, which is that this trial pitted oppressed people against the oppressor. And what Charlie did was to challenge the courtroom and the jury and the public to rethink what they knew or what they thought they knew, to look at the facts of the case through a different prism. He wasn't just saying, well, you don't have enough evidence, my client is not guilty. He was talking about looking at society in the way it really is, accepting the idea that police officers could target a black man because he was a political leader, and that a police officer could lie, and that a black man with a criminal record and a militant, outspoken militant position could be telling the truth. One of the most astonishing things that they did in this case was they put Huey on the stand to testify against a police officer, against and two bystanders, African Americans, who happened to be there and who were witnesses for the prosecution. Against their testimony, they put Huey on the stand with his criminal record because they believed that if the jury heard him and if he were allowed to speak and if he were allowed to talk about what he was really about, what the Black Panthers were really about, that the jury would have at least a better impression of him than they did based on the stereotypes that they had and the assumptions that the prosecution wanted them to make. And they succeeded. The jurors, in fact, responded very favorably to Huey. And obviously, this was a compromise verdict. There were those who wanted to acquit him completely, and certainly those who wanted to convict. But the trial itself was important because it challenged assumptions and because it represented a political struggle, and it was tried in that way. And the trial itself was also very important because Charlie Gary, in that trial, almost single-handedly uplifted the art of voir dire. Books have been written about Charlie Gary's voir dire in that case, one by Anne Fagan Ginger, who's a local lawyer, estimable, wrote a book called Minimizing Racism in Jury Trials, which is almost entirely made up of lengthy portions of voir dire from Charlie. And no lawyer that I ever knew was as instinctive as Charlie was. I mean, he led with his soul and his heart even more than his mind. And there's one little thing, all of us criminal defense lawyers have tried to do the kinds of things that Charlie did on voir dire with, not as much success, but some. But there's one thing that every criminal lawyer that I have ever met has tried to do and has done. And Charlie's was the original, and give me a minute, it's worth looking at, because you've probably heard something like it before, but it's Charlie's from the Huey Newton trial. He's questioning this fellow, Strauss. Strauss has said, well, I know something about the case. I have believed that Mr. Newton is guilty, but I'm willing to listen with an open mind. And Charlie asked him, well, you believe that he was guilty? Yes. And isn't it going to be hard to put that away? No. And the judge kept saying, this is fine. Charlie asked for a challenge for cause. No. And then the judge said to Mr. Strauss, first, Charlie asked him, as you sit there right now, do you believe that Huey Newton shot and killed Officer Fry? Answer, I don't know whether he shot him or not. That I cannot say. Well, wait a minute, what about the presumption of innocence, right? So the judge jumps in, and the judge says, wait. So therefore, as it stands right now, do you believe he is guilty before you hear any evidence? No. All right, so this Charlie again was stymied. The judge was not going to let this juror go for cause. And so Charlie asked him again, you really believe that you can be, you can look solely at the evidence in this case and employ the presumption of innocence? And he said yes. And so Charlie looked at him and said, as Huey Newton sits here next to me now, in your opinion, is he absolutely innocent? Yes. But you don't believe that at all, do you? No. Excusal granted. So the verdict in the case, was somewhat unsatisfying, the voluntary manslaughter, but in a certain way, it preserved the importance of the case. A verdict on either direction would have caused havoc. Whether it had been an acquittal, I think violence would have been visited on young black folk all around the country by police officers for a long time. And a complete conviction would have been, would have outraged the black community. I think the voluntary manslaughter, I'm not advocating for it, but I'm saying as it happens, it allowed Huey and the Black Panther Party to go on with their work. It allowed Huey to remain a viable leader in the Black Panther Party, and it allowed the Black Panther Party to remain a credible part of the movement in this country. We are given a few minutes for rebuttal, but since I'm second, if I have to, this is a debate, so I have to do a little bit of negativity. If I save my rebuttal until after Howard, he won't have a chance to respond. So I just wanted to say this about the Angela Davis trial.
Here we go.
Which is very simple. Without in any way taking away from my enormous respect for Angela Davis and who she is and what she's done, or demeaning in any way the accomplishments of her extraordinary trial team, of which Howard was a major part. The simple fact is that without Huey Newton, there would have been no Angela Davis trial. Without Huey Newton, there would have been no George Jackson. There would not have been the kind of community support for George Jackson. There would not have been the kind of community support for prisoners and the prison liberation movement. There would not have been the activity and the support for Angela Davis. There is a direct line from the Huey Newton trial to the Angela Davis trial. It's an unbroken line. It's the people and what's at stake and the issues and the facts. And the Huey Newton case is the trial of the century because it changed how people looked at political trials, and it has made possible all of the political trials that came after it. Thank you.
So, People versus the State of California, O.J. Simpson, John Burris.
When Lisa asked me would I do this, I thought everyone already knows about O.J. Simpson, so what more is there to say? Until I asked a couple young people in my office, and they never heard of it. So I realized that there's a lot to be said about it. Now, when I started to consider the issue of trial of the century, I wanted to know what was the standard, what's the criteria for evaluating it? Is it a political trial, such as we've had discussion about, or is it another type of trial, or can it be another type of trial? And I looked at J. Anthony Lucas was a man whose name was given to me, who had some discussions about this, and he said, number one, it has to be a spectacular show trial. Number two, has great national drama. And three, it has to attack and stir the soul of the American population. And when I looked at those criteria, it's pretty clear to me that O.J. Simpson, for the time and place it was done, clearly falls within that criteria. Because when you look at who he was at the time in which this happened, some of you may already know, but certainly as an African-American male, he had been as famous a celebrity as one could be for his period of time. He had been an All-American football player, an NFL player, a TV commentator, a movie, I want to say star, but he was in the movies. I mean, he thinks he was a star, but I don't think much other people would. But he was a celebrity, and the most important part of that, he was a crossover celebrity. He was a person who transcended race in ways that very few other African Americans had done before. So that gave him a particular social status here. And so when his ex-wife was found dead, along with maybe her boyfriend Ryan Goldman, and he was the suspect, it sent shockwaves throughout the America, and certainly throughout the world. And so what emanated from that process was the media saturation. And like unlike some of the other cases that we've talked about, certainly there was media attention, but there was nothing like the media attention that came with O.J. Simpson. And all you have to do is remember the Bronco ride, where over 95 million people watched it. 95 million people were watching O.J. Simpson as he makes this ride back where he had given this suicide note and yet didn't have the courage to commit suicide, as we all thought at the time. And so he created the kind of interest that no case had ever done so in American life. Just as a summary, there was 133 days of everyday television. This trial lasted for 133 days. And at the time the verdict was rendered, 91 million people had 91% of all TV viewers were watching it. And many, 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 many more million heard about it on radio, were sitting by their radio or listening to their medias. So from a interest, this case topped all other cases. And I remember at the time that I was part of the, quote, talking heads that came about as a consequence of the O.J. Simpson trial, which has changed the landscape for forever, you might say. And what I was part, and many others were at Camp O.J. Now, this really had not happened before. Outside of the courthouse, every media outlet, all the national news, CNN, CSNBC, MSNBC, and all the top people from Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Jim Brokaw, they were all present just about every day. Now, what was that all about? I mean, it certainly had this notion that this very famous man had been caught in this high drama, but more importantly, the race issue became front and center very early. And if you remember, the Time magazine, shortly thereafter, darkened the picture of O.J. Simpson and made him look like more of a criminal at that time, when he had been the poster child for America. And so that was the start of this long road down where the issues focused up became clearly race, and the issues underlying race. Whites, blacks. There was never a time during that period of this trial when everyone did not have, no one had an opinion. Everyone had an opinion, guilt or innocent. And the way it broke down, unfortunately, what it unfolded was this racial divide that existed in this country. And we had gone through the civil rights movement, we had gone through the political trials, and in 1992, we had just finished, I had personally just finished the Rodney King trial, and this happened, but underlying it all was this sense that this black man had killed these two white people, one of which was an attractive woman and her maybe boyfriend, and he may not suffer the consequences of it. Another side of it was the black community that basically said it didn't matter what the evidence was. They were not prepared to buy into his guilt. And so you had this running dialogue that was going on every day. When the evidence would come in, it didn't matter. It depends on what side you were on. And you process that evidence based upon the side that you were on. And of course, then you get to the whole dream team. Now, there have been great lawyers. We've heard people talk about the great lawyers in the other cases, but we had truly great lawyers in this case. The dream team, Johnny Conklin was at the forefront of that. F. Lee Bailey was one of the great criminal lawyers of his era, was there. Barry Shack from New York was there, and a few others. And on the defense, on the prosecution side, they had good lawyers. And so as a trial, you had intrigue and you had drama. You had issues that went to the heart of the American judicial system. The issues of the police. Can you trust the police? In that particular case, we had real issues about whether the police, in fact, had planted evidence. whether or not that glove that was found at O.J. Simpson's house was in fact put there by one of the officers, whether or not the officer who claimed that he had never used the N-word was in fact a veteran racist. These presented the kinds of issues that captured the spirit and the soul of the American population at the time. And then we have the prosecution sought to have O.J. Simpson try on the glove. And on that glove, O.J. says, it doesn't fit. Well, you know that became the rallying cry for the entire case. And when Johnny Cochran said in the closing argument, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, that particular statement was heard around the world. And so the case itself had this high emotional drama associated with it. And you had personalities, including the judge, Judge Ito. We had Henry Lee from Connecticut, who basically was the top pathologist in the country. He just basically said, something is wrong. And when he said it, the black community blinked it. The white community dismissed it. And so you had these prisms by which evidence was being evaluated. Now, ultimately, what this really meant was there from the white community point of view, was Johnny Cochran and his team subverting the criminal justice system by bringing in issues of race, bringing in issues of police misconduct. On the other side of that issue is the black community always understood that if a black person kills a white person, they were going to jail, period, and perhaps get the death penalty. So you had these competing forces here that was the underpinnings of what was going on in this trial. And as it went forward, you could see, I could see certainly, and others could see on a daily basis, that maybe the truth wasn't really that important anymore. It was more of a, what side were you really on that mattered most? And there were significant issues that came out of this particular case that I think has had lasting impact. When you think about domestic violence came out of that case, and even though before then, even in O.J.'s case, where he had assaulted allegedly Nicole on more than one occasion, the police had not done much about it. But you all heard, during the course of that trial, her screams that she had given at the time she had been assaulted before by O.J. But after that, police agencies around the country have dealt with this whole question of domestic violence. And so it's become a very, very important issue. So all I can say is that when you evaluate the trial of the century, now if you want to say it's strictly political, that's certainly one thing. But if you want to evaluate it in the context of the impact that it had on American society at the time in which it was being done, then you have to look to see O.J. Simpson's trial, because it was true that around the world, on a daily basis, people wanted to know what happened and what was happening with O.J. Simpson. Margaret Thatcher, when she came to visit the president during the trial, the first thing she said is, did he do it? Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, when he came to visit the president, the first thing he said was, do you think O.J. did it? And that was the cry and the point of the discussion that took place for a long time. In conclusion, though, what that was most troubling was this whole notion that it created this schism between the races. Because the black community was unwilling to accept any evidence that O.J. was guilty, even though there was significant evidence that pointed in his direction. But they were unwilling to do that. It was almost as if it was payback for all the other African Americans who had gone to jail, had been brutalized by the police, and had been treated unjustly by the judicial system, criminal justice system. So there was this sense that this trial was an indictment, if you will, on how a black man could be treated in the criminal justice system? A rich black man. Because everyone understood how a poor black person could be treated, but this was a rich person. And the other side of it is the whites were saying, just because he's rich, that doesn't mean you get to kill these people. And so we had these significant issues. So I would only say in the end, given the massive amount of media attention that was given to this trial, given the fact that it so energized the entire world, if you will, and when that verdict was rendered, if you remember when that verdict was rendered, I was at Camp OJ at the time, the white students at the white universities moaned and groaned. The black students jumped with joy. And it only illustrated that this case sort of pulled a scab off of what people had been trying to do in terms of race relations, and had given this false sense that race relations were in fact good, because O.J. Simpson indicated and reflected that it wasn't. And one last comment, I was coming home on the day of the verdict, and a guy comes up to me, a white guy comes up to me, middle-aged guy, and he says, you know, because of what happened today, Colin Powell will never be president. I say, really? You know? But it also reflected the deep sense of feeling that people had. And he was just an ordinary guy with no political power and nothing. And so, in the end, when you looked at that trial and the issues of who done it, the intrigue, the drama, you know, the manner in which it was tried, you have to say that all things being equal, that this was, in fact, the trial of the century as we know it, and the impact that it had on society at the time in which it happened. Thank you.
I was around during some of these trials, and it brought back a lot of memories. And I was kind of conflicted, trying to remember what it felt like at that time. You know, it wasn't the popular time to stand up for civil rights. It was a very difficult time. I remember the Simpson Trial ending when I worked in Ohio, and how people rejoiced or were very angry based on racial lines. So I remember Angela Davis's trial at the same time that she's being tried was also the same time where we were just starting to wear naturals and black power, and not yet understanding that the media was not always truthful, and how we supported these people in spite of the fact that the negative publicity was coming. So it brought up a lot of stuff about kind of my college days and my understanding of what was going on at that time. So it was really great to reflect and to be here to hear this tonight.
I think the power of Huey Newton and all of these trials, but particularly things where you were not representing just yourself and your individual quote-unquote crime, was beyond a criminal case, and I think that's what made it significant. I enjoyed the presentation, certainly Howard Moore, certainly Doron Weinberg and John Burris's presentation.
It was a fantastic opportunity to listen to some brilliant attorneys and learn a little bit more about the aspects of just being an attorney, but the specific trials that were significant, especially in the Bay Area here. Grasp the ability to understand how some of these brilliant lawyers are also challenged sometimes based on social elements, as you heard today, the aspect of psychology being brought in, the aspect of, again, social bias, and how do you deal with that, and then dealing with the legal elements of it. Was just fantastic opportunity just to engage and learn from them.
Peralta TV, programs that matter.